Grace Volker. I'm an anthropology student through the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I have just discovered a set of remains that I would like to take back to my laboratory, my high-tech laboratory that is not in my childhood bedroom, and observe these remains, identify all the bones in the body, and side those bones. So let me show you this impressively put together set of remains.
Here we have an almost complete set of remains. As you can see, the remains are quite small, which may lead a person to believe that they are children's. But, on closer observation, the epiphyseal plate has fused, meaning the specimen has finished growing, and with other characteristics, such as the shape of the skull, it can be determined that this specimen is an adult. With this hypothesis disproven, the specimen can be examined in a different light. Some may hypothesize the specimen is the member of the Homo floresiensis genus, better known as the hobbit, an individual of the human line that stands only 3.5 feet tall. However, due to the fact that I am standing in Lincoln, Nebraska, and not the island of Flores in Indonesia, this seems unlikely. Nope, it's actually due to funding and availability that are to blame for the size of the specimen in front of us. Now with that determined, let's get this specimen back to the lab and start our observations.
Let's begin.
Commonly known as the forehead, the frontal bone shares its superior borders with the parietal bones at the coronal suture, while its lower borders continue until the orbits, or eyes. The parietal bones are a pair of bones that articulate with the frontal bone, both temporal bones, and the occipital bones. They meet each other at the sagittal suture. Like the parietal bones, the temporal bones come in a pair and can be found on the lower side of the cranium, containing the external auditory medius or ear canal, the mastoid process, which is used to determine sex, the styloid process, mandibular fossa, as well as the posterior portion of the zygomatic arch. The mandible also articulates with the temporal bones. The occipital bone is the midline bone found at the back or posterior side of the skull, which articulates with the parietal and temporal bones. The foramen magnum, or the opening for the spinal cord, is present on the occipital bone, and it articulates with the atlas or first cervical vertebrae. The sphenoid is a butterfly-shaped bone that presides mostly in the interior of the cranium. It articulates with both sides of the skull and is central to the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, ethmoid, zygomatic, palatine, and vomer bones. The vomer bone is a bone that runs down the midline of the inferior nasal aperture. The sphenoid is easily visualized with the top of the skull removed. The ethmoid is a bone that is entirely in the skull and can be seen in the back medial side of the orbit. It articulates with the nasal bones, maxilla, lacrimal bones, palatine bones, frontal bone, vomer, and sphenoid. The lacrimal bones are small bones found just inside the rim of the orbits and house the canals for the tear ducts, or lacrimal ducts. The zygomatic bones, more commonly known as the cheek bones, are a pair of bones that articulate anteriorly with the maxilla, sphenoid, and frontal bone, and posteriorly with the temporal bones. The nasal bones are small bones that are superior to the nasal opening between the orbits. The maxilla is a large bone that is in the area between the orbits and the lower jaw. It articulates with the frontal, ethmoid, nasal, zygomatic, lacrimal, palatine, and vomer bones. The mandible, more commonly known as the lower jaw, articulates with the temporal bones. As for human dentition, the formula for modern humans is 2-1-2-3. The mouth is divided into 4 parts to create the dental formula. The left side is separated from the right side, as well as the mandibular side is separated from the maxillary side. So, for example, The left maxillary dentition consists of 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars, but usually only 2 molars are present because the third is the wisdom tooth, which is commonly removed. Some of the bones found in the skull were not covered due to the fact that they could not be found on the digital site used. These include the hyoid bone, which is found under the mandible to support the larynx or voice box, the palatine bones, which create the upper palate of the mouth, the vomer bone, and the middle ear bones. Next, we will discuss the vertebrae. The human body consists of 24 vertebrae. The first 7 are cervical, the first being the atlas, the second being the axis. Then there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. After that, there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae, found towards the cranial side of the spine, are smaller in comparison to their larger counterparts, the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. Due to the larger amount of weight and stress put on the vertebrae that are more caudal, the vertebrae tend to be larger. All vertebrae consist of a spinous process, superior and inferior articular surfaces, transverse processes, a vertebral foramen, where the spinal cord travels, a body, and an arch. Next we have the sacrum. This bone is found at the bottom of the vertebrae and is made up of 5 fused vertebrae. The sacrum and the 2 pelvic bones articulate at the sacroiliac joint to form the pelvic girdle. Next we have the coccyx, more commonly known as the tailbone, and is found at the caudal side of the sacrum and is made up of about 4 fused vertebrae. Next, we will discuss the rib cage. There are 12 ribs on both sides of the body. 7 are true ribs, 3 are false ribs, and 2 are floating ribs. Most ribs consist of a head, which articulates with the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae, the tubercles, and the inferior border. To side a rib, find the inferior border, a sharpened ridge on the inferior side of the rib, then find the head of the rib. With the inferior border facing down and the head positioned to articulate with the spine, the side can be determined. This rib can be determined to be from the right side of the body. The sternum can be found positioned in the middle of the anterior side of the rib cage. It consists of 3 parts: the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. Next we will discuss the pectoral girdle, which consists of 2 bones. The first is the clavicle, more commonly known as the collarbone. To side this bone, first one must distinguish the superior and inferior sides. The inferior surface of the bone tends to be more rough or rugose due to the large amount of muscle attachments. To determine the medial from lateral side, find the larger of the 2 curves in the bone. It should make up about 2/3 of the bone. That curve is found on the medial side of the bone and is also a convex curve when being observed from the ventral or anterior side of the body. This clavicle is a right clavicle. Next is the scapula, or shoulder blade, which is the other part of the pectoral girdle. To side a scapula, find the acromion process, or where the clavicle articulates. This can be found on the cranial lateral side of the bone. The scapular spine can also be found on the posterior side of the bone. Position the bone so all the landmarks are in the determined areas and side the bone, which in this case is a right scapula. We will now begin to observe the bones of the arms. Initially, we'll look at the humerus, which makes up the upper arm and articulates with the scapula. To side the humerus, find its head, which can be found on the proximal and medial side of the bone. The anterior side of the humerus consists of the trochlea and the capitulum, which is the smaller of the 2, on the inferior end. Like the head, the trochlea is medial. Hold the bone as it would articulate in the body and determine the side. This humerus is the right humerus. Next, we will identify and side the ulna. The ulna, as well as the radius, make up the forearm of a human. The ulna is medial to the radius when in the correct anatomical position. To side the ulna, find the U-shaped trochlear notch to determine the proximal end. The open notch faces anteriorly while the radial notch is lateral. Position the bone, taking into consideration the location of all landmarks, and determine the side of the bone. This ulna is a right ulna. Next for the radius, which is the lateral bone in the forearm in anatomical positioning. To side this bone, find the radial head on the proximal side of the bone. The radial tuberosity is anteromedial or faces both forward and towards the middle. Position the bone and determine the side. This is a right radius. Next we will look at the os coxa, or innominate bone, which is made up of the ilium, ischium, and pubis. To side this bone, find the obturator foramen to determine the medial and anterior side of the bone. The pubis symphysis is where the two sides are fused on the anterior side. From this side the bone, this os coxa is the right side. We will now look at the first long bone of the leg, the femur, or the thigh bone. It is one of the easiest bones to side. First, find the femoral head on the proximal and medial side of the bone, while the linea aspera is posterior. Position the bone accordingly and determine the side. This femur is the right femur. The patella, better known as the kneecap, only has two landmarks we need to know: the apex, or the angular side, and the base, or the rounded side. Identify the apex and the posterior surface, which has indents of the articulating surfaces. Face the apex away from you and balance the patella on a flat surface with the dorsal side facing down, and let go. The patella will tip towards the lateral side, meaning if it falls to the right, it's the right patella. The tibia is one of the bones that makes up the lower leg and is medial in comparison to the fibula. To side the tibia, first determine the proximal and distal side. The medial malleolus can be found on the distal side of the bone as well as the medial side. To determine the anterior from posterior side, find the anterior tibial tuberosity, which is on the anterior side of the bone. Position the bone and find the side. This tibia is the right tibia. The other bone that makes up the lower leg is the fibula, which is lateral to the tibia. To side the fibula, determine the head or superior side from the lateral malleolus or inferior side to find the proximal and distal ends. The lateral side of the distal end is longer than the medial counterpart. Therefore, the lateral and medial sides can be determined. Position the bone and side it. This is the right fibula. And finally, we will look at the bones that make up the hands and feet of modern-day humans. From proximal to distal end of the hand and wrist, it is comprised of 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpals, and 3 groups of phalanges. 5 proximal, 4 middle, and 5 distal. The thumb does not have a middle phalange. As for the ankles and feet of modern-day humans from proximal to distal ends, they are comprised of 7 tarsals including the calcaneus or heel bone, 5 metatarsals, and 3 groups of phalanges, 5 proximal, 4 middle, and 5 distal. The big toe does not have a middle phalange. I hope this helped you have a better understanding of the bones in the human body and how to side them. Thanks so much for listening.